I think we're in a very similar radical transformation where understanding how to raise your agent so that you're building it correctly, you're giving it enough policy, you're keeping it stupid. Keep it stupid, people. Make your agent have as little agency on full impact, that crust of decision making, that crust of differentiation. If you lose control and you try to automate that, all you're doing is a probabilistic look back on what's already been. So you're not really using it to its best ability. The best agents are getting you to get to a compliant state, a known state, a trusted state, and then you have this messy little crust that is differentiation, profit, and exploration. That is the sweet spot of using these things.
Welcome to Smarter Markets, a weekly podcast featuring the icons and entrepreneurs of technology, commodities, and finance, ranting on the inadequacies of our systems and riffing on ideas for how to solve them. Together, we examine the questions: are we facing a crisis of information or a crisis of trust? And will building smarter markets be the antidote? This episode is brought to you in part by Abaxx Technologies. AI agents are fundamentally changing how people and organizations interact with computers and the internet. A race is underway to establish the path that will govern the nature of these interactions. Abaxx Technologies introduces Abaxx Labs as its center for engaging with the developer community through the release of open source software to promote a path that empowers users to maintain control of their identity, data, and agents in digital spaces. Abaxx Labs' first release is the Agents++ library, a subset of Abaxx's ID++ software development kit that has been tuned for use with AI agents. Download Agents++ on GitHub today at github.com/AbaxxLabs. That's github.com/AbaxxLabs.
Welcome back to How to Raise Your Agent on Smarter Markets. I'm Dave Greely, Chief Economist at Abaxx Technologies. Our guest today is Michelle Dennedy, Chief Data Strategy Officer at Abaxx Technologies. We'll be discussing what business leaders and managers will need to do to adapt to a world where their teams include both people and agents, and how they should be thinking about integrating agents into their teams, including how to raise them and how to govern them. Hello, Michelle. Welcome back to Smarter Markets.
Thanks, Dave. Great to be back.
Well, it's great to have you back. We've talked many times about the big challenges that we face in terms of identity and privacy when it comes to our data. And now we're seeing those same challenges playing out in a world of AI agents. And so I wanted to talk with you about today is how do we need to adopt the way we do business to the reality of working with AI agents? How do we raise them? How do we govern them? How do we identify, discipline, and reward them? And I'd like you to speak to the perspective of business leaders who find themselves not only leading and managing teams of humans, but increasingly leading teams of humans and humans managing teams of agents. What does this change require of business leaders and managers?
There are about 17 questions within that question. So let's just break them apart. I love a good analogy, as you know. And so, how do we raise well-behaved agents underneath our well-behaved employee? What does an employee look like when we're talking about all these jobs going away? And what does that mean for the leadership? And I'll say at the top. And really, I think leaders have to stop looking at themselves at the top of a pyramid and perhaps look at themselves more as the nucleus of an organism. So when you talk about agents supporting employees, that starts to exponentially spread the number and the cadence and the speed of decision making that's going on in what we are calling some sort of a corporate or governmental entity. So even deciding where the edge, where the firewalls used to be, we used to have a defined sort of legal and technical edge that we treated like a moat in a castle. Then the analogy sort of spread into a city analogy of protection of, you have guardians on there, you have locks that you do, there's responsibility, whether you're in someone's private space or not, someone's private space. Now in the age of AI and agentic processing, we're talking about something far more fast dynamic, large, and yet we have to be precise and almost have nanoscale governance. So I think the first thing for a leader to do is have a bit of a change of perspective about command and control and have a different perspective about how do we determine what our business outcomes are, what our goals are, and then how do those things break apart across first your people teams? What are the old fashioned KPIs? What are the OKRs? What do you want as the outcome to be? And then understanding that the lines between business units, the lines between capabilities are going to be blurred. We have lawyers who are vibe coding things that they need to be more efficient. That may or may not be going through your security division, which may or may not be up to date with the 6,000 new laws being propounded about AI and agents. So don't give up is my number one rule because it sounds really overwhelming and very confusing. And indeed it is. However, if we start to look at this, think about our own decision making almost as how do we raise our own agentic leadership? How do we have something that is runtime dynamic? We're our own entities. We're running at autonomous operation in dynamic environments. That's what we talk about as software agents. How do we then apply that to the human managers that have to understand, is this thing doing what I think it's doing? Do we know when things go wrong? And can we mark and metric when things go right? And so the leader is really looking for the overall, almost organic health rather than specific tasks, specific punishments, specific rewards. You have to start looking at the entity as a much more horizontal and sideways and organic.
I like it. You're making me think a little bit of an expert mechanic who can listen to the engine of the car run and know what's going right or what's going wrong. Is that a little bit of how you're seeing managing a team with agents? Because it sounds almost like instead of exerting more control, you're saying there might be a need to loosen up the reins a little bit. Did I hear you right or not?
I think that's fair. And I love your analogy actually, because I think the mechanic, especially like I'm imagining the guy in the old fashioned boiler suit with the I'm Dave on his lapel, it instantly made me think. I used to drive a 92 Miata until I sold it, sadly, a couple years ago. When I rolled that thing into the garage, this mechanic came running out with his toolbox and he was so thrilled because there was not a scintilla of compute on board. I had little things, cranks that rolled down the windows and the whole schlamata. So, as you said, he could hear what was going on and say, you've got this problem, or I understand this, or he would drive it around the block and this would what happened. And it wasn't because he was like a car psychic or the car talk guys, frick and frack or click and clack. It was because he understood intimately how that system worked, because he could, because there was a finite level of operations and it really was whatever was contained in the vehicle rather than software updates that were coming in overnight or when you cross state lines, there were different people surveilling certain information and giving you feedback loops that you didn't really understand. So the complexity of the cars and the complexity of the sort of supply chain around the car now means that that very self-same mechanic still can have an intuitive understanding of what's going on, but that intuition now must be fed by reliable information coming from a group of sources that he may or may not control. And that means understanding that some of these indicators, whether it's coming out of an agentic system or it's coming out of an LLM probabilistic search to try to diagnose things, he has to understand that some stuff is going to be wrong. He has to understand, just like the old fashioned mechanic, how do I sort of drive this information around the block, if you will? How do I test which agent is actually giving me high fidelity information? And then understand, how do we do a little more experimentation? Because you're not going to have I decide this, I tell you to do this, my expectation is known, and you come back when it's done and I can measure the work. It's more like, I know the car's not running. I understand that this is something that typically has broken in the past, or this is an input that we typically need. Or I see the outcome at the end of it and I see that it's driven to the wrong location and we're sort of we're both being forensic about what happened, and we're also ourselves becoming more and more probabilistic. I know that a lot of this stuff is generated and some of it might be hooey, but if it's directionally fine enough for what I'm doing in the moment, that might be fine. And so the discernment is important for the mechanic. Am I dealing with a steering column that might be 2 degrees off and it's annoying to drive versus the brakes have gone off? And so understanding where you need that precision, understanding where you can live in a world of imprecise, but it's kind of telling the weather, and competition that might say refining the known unknowns might be your competitive edge. So it's all of those things. And so I think this is why you're also hearing in leadership circles the sort of renaissance of the Renaissance learner or student or leader, where it's not the smartest. I love there's Jensen Wang from NVIDIA was talking about, he was asked who was the smartest person he'd ever met. And he's such a thoughtful guy. He used to be a neighbor of mine, such a sweetheart. And he very thoughtfully said, it used to be the guy who was like the greatest technician or engineering guy or the guy who could code, but now everyone can code. So that was the first thing to go when AI took over was how to do software because software is math, y'all. And probabilistic systems are pretty good at math. The harder part is the humanities. What should happen? What did happen? Why did it happen? And then looking out at someone else's very complex system that we call a competitor or maybe even a core supplier and saying, what can I do to make my supply chain more efficient? What do I tell my shareholders anymore about output and prospect and new competitors coming up on the horizon? All of that takes this approach that people in the humanities understand so well. And quite honestly, why a lot of engineers went to engineering schools is they hoped for big A answers. And now we're back in the world of my profession, which is legal profession, which is it depends. So understanding how do you do this and how do you run it, I think is a really important thing. I'll go on one more caveat and then I'll come. I told you I was going to say shorter answers today, but I clearly lied. I think the interesting thing is you look at who the CEOs of particularly large corporations are these days. They are most often salespeople. So yes, there's often finance people, but there are very few people. There's people you can count on kind of one hand that are engineers first, not in sales, not in some dynamic. And why is that? Because they too do not have control over everything that's happening in the organism that is that corporation. What they are doing is dealing with perception, story, and strategic motion forward into the unknown. And so that is what you have to do in sales. And that is something where you add that plus technical wherewithal. That doesn't mean you have to know how to code everything. And one of our CTOs, Richard Schaefer, always says, I don't know what I'm talking about in technology. And guess what? I know that. And so that's why I talk to Rich. So understanding that you have to have these multiple skills, understanding that you have to know what you don't know, and understanding, like that mechanic, to actually have and trust and take a risk on having an intuition that leads your next move.
And so we need more and different things from our leaders and managers in this new world. I wanted to look at the other side of it and ask, what should we be asking of the agents, to anthropomorphize in a dangerous direction? But as we're raising them, like if you bring a new person onto your team, right, there are like expectations driven by the culture of the industry, the culture of the particular company. There's the way that you behave on a job and the way you work well with others. Do we need to be thinking about that as we're creating these agents? And will they work and play well with each other and the other humans?
Absolutely. And again, I'm offending all the engineers and I'm kind of loving it that we're making them people like for these agents. We're humanizing them. But the way that you're talking about it is exactly the right way that I think about it, which is remembering that these agents are not components in traditionally, although I will defend myself in the Privacy Engineers Manifesto. When we talked about a privacy component, the reason it was not able to be enabled when we published in 2014 is we didn't have the LLM spread that we have today. So a component is typically something that has rules and executes in a known kind of way. Agents are much more dynamic. Some of them are run off of LLMs, some are coming off of vector databases. The key thing in your analogy is perfectly right. When you bring on someone new, when you're bringing on the first new incremental person, when you're building your organization, and that person is coming in as an intern, for example. So I know they're coming in as an intern. Do I allow them to write the script for our CEO to do our public disclosure of financials at the end of the quarter? No. I tell that little agent, here's the coffee pot, here's how I like it. And your job is to get to know the organization and do these single layer things that can be judged. You can be trained, you can learn more, you can get exposure as you get more and more senior. The agents of today, my favorite agents of today, are dumb. Give them as little to propose as possible that can be repeated because you know what you're talking about. You don't want things that are agentic coming out and doing dynamic processing at the end of a roadmap. Who ultimately gets a mortgage or not? You don't want an agent making that call. And it's more than saying, have a bunch of AI and agentic processing happening, buy a bunch of data, and then the quote unquote human in the loop is just signing off on stuff. You don't want that. That's not really human in the loop. So when you're starting to look at what are the agents, do I want an agent to read my email and give me a summary? That's a pretty straightforward task. They may get nuance wrong, particularly depending on what type of role you play in the organization. My agent would probably take off sick days after reading my email because I'm kind of everywhere all the time. But if you're looking through and saying, I want everything that says accounting, I want everything that says AP, AR, and I want it categorized and organized. So what I'm asking it to do, the scope of what I'm asking it, where to do, and the output, understanding that we're sort of going back to the good old fashioned Grace Hopper days. Early compute, we really interrogated what our business needs were before we started building. Then we went through this whole renaissance of software where people weren't vibe coding, but they were using tangible compute, grabbing chunks of code hither and yon, sticking things together, doing an agile performance that may or may not have been documented because you had some of the old waterfall guys telling you, like, you really do need to document so you can troubleshoot. So I think we had led to this whole bubble where it was sort of code first and fast, break things, and then hope for the best. And we kind of got away with that for a very long time. I think because of the speed, because these things are dynamic, because it's so much complexity and so much data, it's very, very difficult to go back and do a retrospective with this stuff. The best thing you can do for yourself as a leader is really understand what is the data that you need to do the business things that you need to do. What could you be doing better that really could be automated, like non-disclosure agreements? Why are people spending hours and hours of person legal time doing this? You have a fairly straightforward need, you have a fairly straightforward type of company, and you have a fairly straightforward time period. That's the kind of stuff, even in a nuanced legal profession, that you can start to now say, let's at least come up with the document. And you've already skipped ahead 10 hours of legal time you would otherwise be paying for. It is a complex task when you think about it in toto, but now you can actually enable your humans to do higher order things faster while keeping the brain drain from weighing them down. Now, the agents at the higher level and the agents that are used for different purposes might be much more complex. But I will posit that that's where I'd like to see a lot more wherewithal understanding how that agent or those agents are dealing with the data supply chain. Get down and dirty with your data supply chain. How clean is it? How much quality is it? How much fidelity do you need from it? And I think when we start to think about leadership in that way, understanding where agents go isn't what is Microsoft doing. It's more what does Acme Co. really need to do to excel.
And there's the leadership, there's also the policy. Like, what do we need to be changing at the corporate policy level? And how do we need to be thinking about governance in a company that has AI agents?
Yeah, I will say, and we'll try to get him on the show, there's a notion of non-invasive data governance. And Rob Seiner has talked about this since I think 1995 when he started first publishing his data newsletter that's now owned by Dataversity. It's called TDAN.com, and it's all about data. And so the governance of this is really important, and important that it's non-invasive. You're not going to stop and take out all the code you've got. You're not going to be able to do a full security check on every single agent that you buy, borrow, or build. What you are going to have to do is understanding really where are your data stewards, the old fashioned data stewards. They're the guys who understand enough about what the business is and the outcome. They have enough wherewithal and hands on what data is making what decisions and where and what are the sources that they can start to report up to the person who's higher in the organization that's assimilating what all of these things are doing together. I think this goes back to before we even get to agents, what I've always said when people come, I like to mentor young professionals, and many people have come and said, I really want to be a vice president. No, in financial world, it's flipped. So in everywhere but finance, VP is higher than director. Of course, if you're a financial person, director is higher than VP. But assume for a moment, I mean, VP outranks director. And a lot of people want it. And so I always sit down with them first and say, what are your goals? And sometimes it's just that is the next thing that seems it's better because it's better. And the reality is the job, if you do it well, is very different. If you are a specialist and what gives you joy is building things within your specialty, expanding and deepening your knowledge of that world, and continuing to be sort of nano famous in your world, not for ego, but just really this is how you want to operate, then the director level is perfect for you. I want you to be a subject matter person. I want you to train the ranks up there. And I want, most importantly, you're now the funnel up to the VP ranks. And what do you have to do to get to from the stuff that's happening from the manager layer, the operational layer, up to the VP layer, is you have to really understand how to squish down and summarize all of the things that are happening so you become a person agent. So what you're spitting out to me as the VP is really the assimilation of all of the data points that you understand, at least in your specialty. If you're a great director, you're starting to partner up with other directors from other specialties. So you're giving an even more enriched sort of cog that has little hooks on it so that when I go to the next person in under my sort of umbrella of VP over director, I can also take all of those blocks of things that are about disparate things, talking about human resources, we're talking about marketing stuff, we're talking about legal stuff, we're talking about building stuff, supply chain stuff. They seem very disparate, but at the VP level, and this is where we're starting to talk, where does all the automation go in our sort of analogy here to agentic planning? I always say the VPs are very dumb. And I said that with humility and humor because I was one for very many years. But I wasn't actually dumb, as it turns out. But what I had to be is I had to take my hands off the steering wheel and stop having an opinion about how to interpret a law that was happening in Luxembourg, little Roman I sub A. Even if I had a different opinion on that very specific legal topic or sales topic or whatever, I had to, if I was driving my organization well, I had to say, this is a reasonable opinion that my director level person has presented. They have the data to say this is moving us in the same direction. My job is to set directionality and understand and interrogate, is this a good enough data element rather than have endless conversations about specificity so that I can have speed. So when I look at that leadership element and where we're taking the fidelity of the data coming up through each of these types of business processes, how are they appended to either the causality or even the correlation of results that I want to start to measure so that I can then go to the CEO and have my own summary of what my overall business unit is doing. So those roles are very different, and how you think about how you communicate, how much time you spent talking to humans versus reading books or building code or eating Doritos in the late of night. Those different skill sets are now we're starting to look at that and go, which of these things for each of these job tasks is possible to be automated in some way? Can it be dynamically automated in some way? And then as you get into those higher orders of how leadership operates today, which is still quite hierarchical, how do we have enough fidelity so that we know how to adjust and we know how to go down and say, this is where you're actually not dumb as a VP. you know enough about what's going on and you're aware enough with the types of culture and personalities and outcomes that you can get that you now can think about what is the next task. I have a finite bucket of resources, whether those are compute resources, power resources, money resources. And now, how do I deploy them when I go back down to my directors and say, operationalize this? So you're always sort of in the middle of a funnel, if you will, as that level of leadership. I know I'm waxing on prolifically about this one too. I've thought about this one for decades because the other dynamic here that I think it's going to be interesting in an agentic world of data is for most very large corporations, when you are a VP, you are no longer playing the person who is the scholar. You are now playing Game of Thrones because side to side, everybody else is using all of their data and all of their resources to get what they think is the most important thing to happen. And once you get all the way up to the board, you maybe have 5 minutes if you're not in sales, maybe. And so to figure out what do you need to do and how do you need to run your organization for the next quarter with this tiny little dot of sunlight, you really have to play and you play hard. So it's a fascinating dynamic. I've always said that we have all these cop shows and these doctor shows and these lawyer shows. And I'm like, you have no idea with Startup Landia, which is his own version of Game of Thrones, and what happens in the dynamics of real leadership. There's lots of people coasting with big titles that just kind of show up at meetings. And I'm discounting all of them. I'm talking about the 10% that run every company on the earth. And there's only about 10% that really are running things.
And I want to get into that with you because there's been a couple ideas I wanted to get back to. One is the idea of the pyramid company structure versus the cell and the nucleus. And the other is you said you need to be able to understand and interrogate when you're at that VP leadership level. And thinking in terms of the pyramid dynamic, right? Always the higher up in the pyramid you go, the more you become reliant on the judgment of the people below you. And the more your ability to judge their performance becomes the valuable thing. And as we move into this world of agents, getting the work done is no longer the rate limiting factor. The rate limiting factor is to be able to judge whether the work was done well. And kind of to anthropomorphize again, if you have a team that's prone to hallucinating and will just kind of BS you, that is a very scary thing. The higher you go up in the pyramid, because you're standing on a house of cards. How are you thinking about, I guess, one, how judgment and the ability to assess whether work is being done well becomes the much more valuable skill in this world? And then, I guess, two, how do you think about making sure that those agents beneath you are trustworthy?
Yeah, these are two huge, huge things. I think the good news, because we like to keep it optimistic, you have more assistance yourself than ever before to help you along your journey. So I am an attorney by trade. I always tell people I am an attorney, I'm just not your attorney, because I have to check up on what the latest committee meetings are doing about the law. To do that in a legal and providing legal advice manner, I have to look at original text, I have to do the work, or I have to call a specialist. But if what I need is the directionality of I think things are going here, I too can get a summary from one of these LLMs. And I can tell because I do have experience in this field, I'm like that mechanic and I can smell BS. And sometimes I do. You get things out of, and it's every platform. It's not just ChatGPT, it's all of the platforms. When you are a specialist sitting in the specialty, the output looks much worse than if you're like, wow, it's so organized and there's topics and bullet points. Oh my. So I think the good news is you do have the ability to like just ask the error. You say the ALXEA or the SIRI words, and you can ask how to spell anything, what the formula is, what's Boyle's law. So getting the facts right, facts are cheaper and cheaper. So that's great. So you have that at your disposal as a leader. Understanding what metrics mean stuff while the world is so dynamically changing economically, politically, technically, and this whole kind of shock of who gets what job and what job is a good job. All of that unknown stuff, the people who are going to keep going forward, it's almost like in the age of great exploration, People really thought there were dragons out there. The people who are going to lead the hardest and the best and the most take what they know of the stars and the seas and the lighthouses, and they don't just follow the paths before them. They follow the paths before them. So we follow what we know of data stewardship, data quality, quality checking. And I'm going to circle back to policy because remember, policy reflects business rules. That's all policy is. People sort of think of it as compliance underwear, like cover your butt. We've got a policy. What a policy should always have been, and the best policies do, is they signal behavior that people can actually follow to be collectively going in one direction that is in harmony with the business rules so that you're following what other companies have done in your genre to an extent. And most importantly, if we all know what to do, that are the basics: how not to do insider trading, how not to commit fraud, how to get your budget approved, all of that, if you don't do it well, is inefficiency noise. So having a great policy and making sure people know what that policy is critical, because then we get to where everyone else kind of is, and the beautiful layer of uncertainty happens. And where there's a layer of uncertainty, there is a layer of opportunity. That's where you understand really well, not just what today's customers want, but what tomorrow's customers want. That's where, like Steve Jobs' magic wasn't technical innovation. It was he refused to believe in the physical limits of the known world of chips and design and hardware, and then sold a story that everybody wanted to buy into. The guy announced that network computing and time sharing all mushed together was quote unquote the cloud. Once we all had that figure in our mind that something could be existential and far away from ourselves and far away something I had to own, then we could embrace, how do we now set policy? How do we now react? What does it mean to compete? And it seems antiquated to think that you have to have your own server room for every single operation. That's a radical thought. And today, if you're born after 2005, you think, well, of course not. Well, it was a radical transformation when that shift happened. I think we're in a very similar radical transformation where understanding how to raise your agent so that you're building it correctly, you're giving it enough policy, you're keeping it stupid. Keep it stupid, people. Make your agent have as little agency on full impact, that crust of decision making, that crust of differentiation. If you lose control and you try to automate that, all you're doing is a probabilistic look back on what's already been. So you're not really using it to its best ability. The best agents are getting you to get to a compliant state, a known state, a trusted state, and then you have this messy little crust that is differentiation, profit, and exploration. That is the sweet spot of using these things. And then you can do experimentation. We have Abaxx Labs. This is where we build things that don't exist yet and things that we think solve a very important problem to fill in as glue between the markets that we do know exist. We need trusted means of communicating in a market that you can trust, that you can move much faster than ever before. We need transparent pricing on stuff that we know that we need and stuff that we know that we will need. These are our known like hard terra firma. The glue in between is, what will we need to do this more efficiently? What will make everyone else in the market understand how to read and understand our differentiation? And I think that's a beautiful place to understand your known and your small agents go into the known and well-trod and well-tested business rules. Your more exploratory experimentation work goes into some sort of a containment, not necessarily a closed sandbox, but somewhere where you know you're experimenting and you're not betting the whole company on just exploration and just stuff that you simply don't understand.
And one other thing I wanted to ask you about is there's the understand and interrogate when it comes to the agents. There's also the in this transformational time, which you said is like moving from server rooms to cloud. Business leader can find themselves in the position that they know much less than the subject matter experts that work for them. So, how should business leaders who are finding themselves in that position handle this today? And so I guess specifically, what questions should they be asking their developers or their engineers?
I kind of love this because what's popping into my head, I'm actually writing a book right now called Lighthouse Leadership: How to Build Systems That Don't Consume People. And I'm applying this model both on leadership in exactly this world, as well as the output, big air quotes, the known world of parenting, for example, or family dynamics. And it's interesting because, and this is a gross oversimplification, but what we think of as feminine versus male energy, the feminine energy is like I look at my kids and I think that they're smarter and prettier and more capable than me. And the male energy has typically been like, I will tell you what to do and you will do it. So you're sort of assuming the command and control model that exists today is very like war based and campaign based and all this stuff. It assumes that the person at the top has a definitive directional that is quantitative almost. And I'm being very ish about this intentionally. The leadership model of assuming that you are going to put your ego aside and hire a lawyer that's much smarter than you if you're a lawyer. You're going to put your ego aside and you're going to ask a lot of humbling questions. How does this work to your developers? And even if you don't know how to code yourself, once you start talking to these people and asking them questions, and I have a whole chapter in the book called Tell Me More. I'm not going to tell you how to be a developer, but if you tell me how you develop things and how you're preparing at light speed, things that we can measure, provenance, timing, origin of stuff beyond provenance, which is sort of reductive, but all of those things, once I tell them, I need this sort of stuff from you, and I sit back and I just say, tell me more about how you think you can document things. Tell me how you are applying policy to this rather than building this and hoping to God that I can write you a magical policy that will disclaim anything you happen to have built wrong, which never works. But by sitting back and really understanding that the best people that we're going to be recruiting to work directly for us, building agents that we can trust, they better be smarter than you. I've seen this in organizations that I worked at. We're talking Fortune 10s and 50s, where a new CEO or an insecure CEO will surround himself with a bunch of yes men, and he will now be anesthetized from the truth because they're all saying what he already knows instead of the best organizations that say, hey, bud, I love you. You're my boss, but here's some data. And you still get to make the call. And that's why I was ish about directionality. But the ones who, and I think Jensen Wang, again, let's bring him back to him. I just saw his interview. He's more of a nucleus kind of a guy. He has a very flat organization. He has way too many direct reports, but he also hires really, really good people. I'm sure he has clunkers in there. We all do. But he hires really good people and he trusts them to be really good people at what they do best rather than just being a dictator.
Before you go, and we could talk for hours, I want to bring it back to something you care about deeply, in addition to people, which is data. And we're already hearing many stories of massive data problems caused through the use of AI agents, or the poor use of AI agents. And I just wanted to get from you, how big is that current threat to our data? And what's our biggest opportunity to use this moment to get it right?
Yeah, I'll end on the high because boy, there's a lot of low. I mean, AI has killed people. Like I'll start at the lowest of the low. Character AI was telling kids who were in distress and telling their AI friend that they hated their parents or they were depressed. And then they would get very explicit instructions on how to kill themselves or murder their parents. That's not hyperbole, that's in the litigation papers. Obviously, something went very wrong building guardrails. You do see, and of course, I play with these AIs and I say outrageous things to see what they'll come back with. The best ones will be like, are you sure you feel that way? Here's a suicide hotline, or don't talk about burning books. That's wrong. Some of that moralistic stuff is kind of interesting and quaint, but it signals that there's at least somebody trying upstream to realize that algorithms are not definitive, but they feel more definitive when you see something written or you see something that's coming from a different source or something seems so much more sophisticated and complicated and comprehensive than you. As human beings, we take that on board and we give it a much higher score as we're trying to go through the world. I think that obviously plays out in human dynamics where people are privately and secretly pouring their hearts out to these engines because it's a lot easier than telling a parent or a counselor or a friend. And the LLMs are learning from that. I think it also plays out in things like mortgage, where people are making assumptions about who we live with, getting GPS data even to see how often you go to your job. There's all sorts of incantations where you can see this data squeezing out people that should have a chance to be first-time buyers, who may come out of communities that aren't traditionally very wealthy, that may or may not be incrementally pushing out the highest profit for the broker, but this is someone who needs to live in the community in some way. That's just one example. And I think it works for healthcare. It works for medical data and research. We've only actually looked at women's depression since I think like 2010. It's some really recent number. I'm probably fudging the number, but I just read an article about the actual body of work because they excluded women because of our hormonal life is different than men. Turns out men have menopause too, but we've learned about research about men's mental health much later, women's bodies much later. So if I just went to a pure LLM, it's changed a little bit. But when they first came out and I said, what are my risk factors without putting in my name, which is a male name too in French society, but mostly a female sounding name, it would say that for my age and my demographic and my race, I probably am at highest risk for prostate cancer. Well, friends, I don't have prostate. I feel pretty good that I may have a lot of other things going on, but that's not the one. But you can see in a very complicated system, if we are reductive about our decision making and who gets insured for things, what procedures cover things, these are very complex decision making. And it's very easy to trust that you're not the bad guy saying no to someone with limited resources if an agent popped out a report for you. So I think that judgment, that discernment, almost that cynical decision making that I think the younger generation is starting to glom onto, almost a mistrust and a prove to me that you are the agent that I am seeking. I think that is a little bit of ray of sunshine. I think the other thing that's interesting, and I always say this, particularly in privacy circles, privacy is incredibly complex, not because it's impossible to do, but it is incredibly contextual, time-bound, and probabilistic. So I always use the analogy of a restaurant. Like I make a reservation, that table is mine at 8:00 p.m. It's probably mine for maybe 2 hours. If I go show up in the middle of the night and I want to sit at that table, I'm now breaking the law. But I had a very small window of cultural and business and sort of licensing. And it's the same thing in a bathroom booth. I said this when I testified before the Senate in 2019. We talk about in public life in the US. When I go into a bathroom stall, my expectation is I am on my own. But also the way we build bathroom stalls in the US is really weird. Like there's all sorts of gaps and there's a big hole at the top and the bottom. Europeans come over here and go, this is not acceptable behavior. There should be a door that goes from floor to ceiling. It should be truly a quote unquote private, secluded compartment. So you can see culture, you can see expectation, you can see building codes are all wrapped into this notion. The good news is because you can have vector type databases that have different elements that weight differently, and those things can be put into a runtime agent to make probabilistic decisions. As long as you're not over-rotating on definitiveness and putting the humans in the right place in the loop and testing the agents that are consistently coming up with non-drift type trajectories, I think there's a huge possibility that we can actually point the AI back at the AI system and do agentic governance as well as agentic forward thrust processing.
Thanks again to Michelle Dennedy, Chief Data Strategy Officer at Abaxx Technologies. We hope you enjoyed the episode. We'll be back next week with another episode of How to Raise Your Agent. We hope you'll join us.
This episode is brought to you in part by Abaxx Technologies. AI agents are fundamentally changing how people and organizations interact with computers and the internet. A race is underway to establish the path that will govern the nature of these interactions. Abaxx Technologies introduces Abaxx Labs as its center for engaging with the developer community through the release of open source software to promote a path that empowers users to maintain control of their identity, data, and agents in digital spaces. Abaxx Labs' first release is the Agents++ library, a subset of Abaxx's ID++ software development kit that has been tuned for use with AI agents. Download Agents++ on GitHub today at github.com/AbaxxLabs. That's github.com/AbaxxLabs. That concludes this week's episode of Smarter Markets by Abaxx. For episode transcripts and additional episode information, including research, editorial, and video content, please visit smartermarkets.media. Please help more people discover the podcast by leaving a review on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or your favorite podcast platform. Smarter Markets is presented for informational and entertainment purposes only. The information presented on Smarter Markets should not be construed as investment advice. Always consult a licensed investment professional before making investment decisions. The views and opinions expressed on Smarter Markets are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the show's hosts or producer. Smarter Markets, its hosts, guests, employees, and producer, Abaxx Technologies, shall not be held liable for losses resulting from investment decisions based on informational viewpoints presented on Smarter Markets. Thank you for listening, and please join us again next week.